broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to our MWF webinar this week. My name is Tanya, and I'm the marketing manager over here at Struxoft Solutions. Just for those of you who are new with us today, MWF, or Metalwood Framer, is our automated Revit wall, floor, ceiling, and truss framing software for light-gauge steel and also wood modeling. Today, however, our senior technician, Christina, will be walking you through wall setup and visibility basics, including general settings, panel manager, and various methods to view and edit panel information. Just before we get going, I want to remind everyone that at the end of the webinar, we'll be taking a few live questions. In order to be selected, please press the raise hand button on the dashboard. Please also make sure that your mic is working correctly. If you'd prefer, you can also ask questions throughout the webinar in the questions tab of the GoToWebinar dashboard. We'll make sure to get back to you by email within 24 hours. All right, that's it for me. I'm going to hand off to Christina now.
All right, thanks, Tanya. Hey, everyone, good morning. So for today's webinar, it's going to be kind of simple. I thought I'd mainly take you through some wall setup and visibility options. So namely, some of the options here in the general settings, a few of the main ones in there. Maybe we'll touch on the panel manager, some of the selection options. And maybe we've got some time, we'll do some renumbering and renaming options. So I thought I'd just kind of touch on some general features that I'll usually cover in session 1 of a training and some basic setup material before we even get started with framing. So I've already got kind of a little house set up over here with some panels just for today. And before you even get started, we're going to start off with the settings. And one of the very first things for anyone who's used the software before, I'm sure you know this, but first thing you'll have to do on any empty project is load your data. So for anyone who is new to the software, loading in data is basically what's going to load in your markers, your joins. It's basically going to fill in the marker manager with all of our kind of default content that comes out of the box with the software. So it's obviously pretty simple. You just go ahead and load in your data. There's the light gauge steel default if you're in light gauge. There's wood, obviously, if you're in wood, depending on which version of the software you have. This is actually a good little window to point out. Sometimes we do reuse the same families, namely for the joins, we'll reload in that same arrow. So you'll see this pop up a few times, but just hit apply to all and yes. And it basically just overrides and continues loading in all of your markers. So I've already got mine loaded in, which is just why I got that other little window. But again, everything is just loaded into your marker manager. It's also another option to kind of bring some default markers back if ever you guys manipulate some of the defaults or delete them accidentally, organize it. If you ever want to bring in those defaults back again, just go ahead and reload in your data and it'll bring in all your markers again. So that's obviously a simple but basic step I wanted to touch on. And something else I do want to point out with the markers in general is that they are actually loaded into the project. You can find them in the project browser under structural connections. So if I wanted to see my openings, for example, you can actually see under the void framing, these are where all the markers will be. So there's no real reason to go into these options in the project browser. I mainly just wanted to point them out in case anyone does a project purge. So of course, if they're not being used, they will be deleted upon a project purge. But generally, it's always a good practice with purging anyways to just double check that you're not purging anything that you may need in the future. So I'll usually say make sure you're not purging any of your structural connections, which will include our markers and some of our other data as well. So nice little rule of thumb just to keep in mind. So that's, again, for the settings, loading in your preliminary data. The next one is the project panel names. So this one, again, is pretty simple, but a good option just to show the different naming conventions that we have for the panels. So anyone who's, again, pretty familiar with the software will know that there's a general prefix that you can change in the properties. But besides that, the actual number that we use is just going to follow a sequential numbering. So we start at 1, and then we'll keep renumbering the panels as you go along. So that kind of naming is what we just call the normal naming. So every panel gets its own unique ID. Even if they're identical, it'll still have a different number. And it's the default one that we use out of the box. We do have another naming option called an alternate name. So if actually you do leave it to alternate, it'll keep the normal naming, but you can always assign an alternate name directly in the panel's properties. So you'll see it right here. It's the second option in your general info list. And this will kind of override the numbering, the prefix, it'll override everything. You can call it exterior wall A if you wanted to. Say OK. And it overrides the normal naming completely. So that's one option for the alternate name. And if you also go back to your project naming options in the settings, if an alternate name exists, it will use it. If not, it'll keep with the normal naming convention. But you could always force it, again, to use the normal. And then it'll revert back with the standard naming. So a handy little option to give your panels a unique ID. It's just to give it an alternate name. And last option in the project panel names is with the positioning ID. So for anyone not familiar with positioning, I did touch on it a while back in one of our other webinars. So it'll be on our YouTube page. I encourage you to go check it out. But basically, you can assign members and panels that are identical one ID, and that's where the positioning ID comes in. So for anyone who isn't familiar with the positioning, it's going to be in here in the output options. And basically, you just run the member positioning first. So if I run this quickly, let me not have any panels selected, so it does it project-wide. So again, just to reiterate, I'm not selecting anything, and it'll do it for the entire project. So what I'm doing now is just running member positioning. And member positioning is counting each individual member and giving it one ID. So it'll give you a count and the position ID. So I can go ahead and save that. You can actually click on the individual members now, and you should see that position ID in the properties. But main reason, just for showing the position ID, is so you can run your member positioning, and then once that's done, you can run the panel positioning. So this is what's actually going to assign one unique ID to all identical panels. So I'll just kind of reduce my digits there so I don't get 3 zeros. Again, nothing selected. It's going to run this project-wide, and it'll give me an ID for each panel. And it did find 2 identical ones, so I've got that ID twice. So now that I've ran the positioning, if I actually go ahead and go to my project panel names, we can use the positioning options, and you can use the normal naming convention with the positioning ID. And I probably like this one the most. It gives you your unique panel ID, but then it'll also give you that number on the side. So it's an easy way to identify which ones are identical. You can see here I've got P3 and then P3 again right here a second time. So it'll identify identical panels and give it that one ID. Or if you just wanted to use the positioning ID, you can then go ahead and just use positioning only. So that again, we'll just assign it the same number. So those are some of the general naming conventions. Again, I know I kind of glossed over the positioning, but feel free to go and check one of our previous webinars. I went super in depth into the positioning in that one. And the other thing I'll just mention about the positioning ID, which does come in handy, is that you can create the shop drawings based off that ID, and you can create one shop drawing for X number of identical panels. So you can generate one sheet, and it'll give you the count in brackets of how many of those panels that you have. So a handy little option to be able to label out your panels. So next one on here. This one I'll kind of just explain what it does, but it does work with the bearing options. And it can basically create a detail ID if you have any kind of CAD details you want to associate. You just create a detail ID and link the path to that CAD file. So if I leave my mouse on this long enough, you'll see that it's mainly meant to be used with the bearing options, either in the marker or in the panel's properties. So that bearing option, go ahead and take a look at the panel's properties. You'll be able to associate that detail ID right here, and it's something that you'll be able to pull later on when you go ahead and run the drawings. The next one after the detail callouts is member priorities. And this one is probably not something that you guys will have to go into very often, but it's still a good idea to know what it does. So for our member priorities, as some of you guys know, that whenever we have two members that clash, one of those members will be removed. And basically this list is just that priority list. So if you actually check override priorities, the join members are always going to have priority over any other type of member. So if you do have a door, maybe in this situation, if it was nudged over slightly and kind of interfering with the join, the king stud and any other interfering member would be removed and that join member would stay. So if ever you do want to override that priority, it's fairly simple. You just come in here, override, and then you can move your join members down on the list. So it's basically just to change that priority list. After the join members, opening members are what comes next. So doors are first, then windows, then Revit wall openings. And last on the list, of course, is just your infill members, your cripples. So you could always rearrange that priority list as a global setting if ever you did want to keep your opening members by default. And the other kind of disable option that you can do between your members are headers and sills to tracks. So this also, of course, applies to top plates for anyone in wood. But if you do have maybe openings kind of close to your top tracks, your bottom tracks, even if there's a clash by a 1/16 of an inch, we are going to remove one of the two members. So if ever you do run into that kind of scenario, you can always preserve the two member types. Just disable the clash between the two, and it'll keep both members. So again, kind of particular options, but still good to know. The next one, the project material scheme, super useful, especially those of you on light gauge. This one is simple enough. You can actually color code your member types. So you can pretty simply just kind of add in the family type name, assign it a color. You can assign it a surface pattern, not necessary. And if you do have any panels created, make sure that this is checked off so that they just apply upon regeneration, and you'll get that coloring. So you can do it by type name, super simple. But for anyone on light gauge, there actually is a default range that comes preloaded in. So based on your gauge, it's automatically assigned the color. So I've already got some panels. I'm going to leave this checked off. So then when you actually go ahead and regenerate it, you should see some coloring. So I think I've got 33 mils on my interior walls. My exterior walls are 43. You can, of course, use Revit filters if you're comfortable with that. I just find this a bit easier. And if ever you're not happy with the color, if we want something a bit more punchy than just white, again, you can change out of our default and give it a quick refresh. So project material scheme, simple, but super useful. After that, we've got the subassembly catalogs, which again, I'm not going to dive too much into subassemblies today, but I'll just preface by saying anything that is pre-assembled, or if you want to have a stud pack have its own unique ID, that's essentially what the subassemblies were created for. So you'll see it in a few options for the markers to convert either an opening marker or a stud pack into subassemblies. To give you an idea, if I just go ahead and let's say modify a quick stud, if I want to double it up, you'll see this option countless times, and it's to convert this double stud here into a subassembly. So it's useful if you want a separate shop drawing for just your subassemblies. And the option here in the settings is just to start setting up your catalogs. So when you actually go ahead and create that double stud pack, you can save it to specific catalogs with their own ID. So next three options on this settings list, it's a newer function, I guess I could say, that we've added to the software recently, and that is the lock panel. So the lock panel, it's a simple idea, but can be super useful, especially if you've got a bunch of users working on a project at one time. But basically, if you want to prevent any kind of modifications, prevent any regeneration to a panel, you can grab your wall and lock it. Give it a comment if you'd like. Say okay. And then you'll notice that your wall will turn red. We'll actually kind of assign an overlay on top of the wall. So if you grab it, it'll say that it's a locked panel. And if you try and give this wall a regen, you'll get this nice pop-up saying that it is in fact locked. So locked panels are essentially that, just to prevent any kind of modifications if you manually edited a panel, or could also be just a nice marker, a nice visual to say that you have to go back and maybe take a look at a wall. It does pop up in bright red. So a nice little visual marker. But if a panel is locked, you can still create shop drawings on it. So you can still do post framing options that we have in the software. You just won't be able to actually modify the framing. The other thing you may have noticed is that we do have a full lock option, which does let you run the shop drawings. You can also just do a framing lock. And this one, what it basically lets you do is still apply a whole series to the panel. So for anyone who's punching out their studs, if you want to apply the whole series or regenerate the whole series, you can still do that on a locked wall, as long as it has that framing lock. So that's the general idea, just to prevent any kind of modification. You can always, of course, unlock it, goes back to normal. And then you could also view the status of the wall, which if you click on the panel, just gives you the list of actions that were done to it, which date, the user who did that, and if there were any comments associated with the lock. So that is the lock and unlock. And for anyone on Onyx, you'll also know that it will lock the panels automatically once they've been uploaded. So this is where you could also come back and unlock those walls. All right. Last two options on here. Project join heuristics. Again, kind of a feature that's not commonly used, but still a good idea to know what it does. And this pertains to your joins. So for anyone who's used the joins, you probably know at this point that one of the two walls at a corner or at a T-intersection is going to take priority, and that priority is dependent upon this list. So a good example over here, if you've got walls in a corner, we'll take any wall with a sloped edge as the main wall first. So this one will be taken as the main wall. It's the one that's actually going to be lengthened. But after that, we always do take the shortest wall as the main wall to keep continuous. So if ever you do want to change this priority list, move it up and down, if you actually come to the browse option, you'll notice that the files are saved here on your C drive. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this. So these are the files that we have that actually save those configurations. And what we typically say is just to copy paste the files in a new location. I just made a separate folder in the same path called joins, copied it there. And then you'll notice that there's a little summary over here just saying to point to that new file location to be able to change this list. So I'm just going to quickly, for time, copy this joins to my desktop. So I've got my default files over here. And now I'm just going to hit browse, point it to my joins folder. And with that now, I've got to point it to a new location, not the default one that's in our C drive. But now this enables the configurations. So if you did want the longest wall, instead, you can start moving these configurations around. It activates these buttons. And you'll be able to move your priority list around. So I can take the longest wall now. Same thing with T-intersections. We always take the running wall as the main wall, but you can always change that priority list. And this is going to be, of course, project-wide across all of your joins. So when I go ahead and actually join these together, let me grab the walls. Just give it a easy configuration. Instead of taking the sloping wall by default, it's taking the longer of the two, and the join arrow is going to reflect that. So this is, again, kind of a global style. I know it's a little tricky to set up, but it's pretty simple. It's just to point the files to a new spot, copy them. And this will be project-wide, and you won't have to think about it. Of course, if you do just want to do it for one or two instances, the set wall options and set wall order and the regular joins still apply. So you could always manually manipulate it. instance by instance. If there's only one or two join conditions where you want to change the main wall. So besides the join heuristics, last options on the settings, simple, but probably the most important one is the global import and export. So once you're done modifying your templates, you're done with your markers, if you are going to reuse the same kind of standards, then you can basically do a global export of all of your different types of settings, shop drawing settings included. And it basically just sends everything into one zip file. And pretty much anything that you modify or manipulate can be exported into this zip. So you'll see your template maps, your wall heuristics, if you modified them, the drawing settings, whole series, any kind of blocking configurations. So everything's exported into that one zip file. And you just go ahead and re-import it in the exact same location, and you'll have all of your custom content to load back into a new project. So that is everything in this settings list. Last few little wall visibility options I wanted to cover for today. Basically these three options in the ribbon. The first one being the panel manager. Which again is simple enough, but super useful. It's a list of all of your panels in the project, which level they're hosted to. If they're positioned, it'll give you the position ID in a separate column. And it also gives you the total panel weight. So of course, all of our families have weights. So once that's been updated, it'll go ahead and calculate the total weight from all of the different families. So you could also easily just click on it. It highlights the panel in the model. And there's also options in here to access the properties. You can delete panels from this spot. And the other nice thing is that if you select a panel and close, it does stay highlighted. So if you want to isolate the wall quickly, if it's a pretty busy project, it's a handy feature I use all the time just to be able to isolate the walls. The next one, again, simple but useful, quick search. Same kind of idea. You can search by the panel name. You can do partial matches. It will highlight the panel for you in the model. And again, as soon as you hit exit, the wall stays highlighted. So you can either isolate it quickly with Revit, or if you just want to access the properties, again, a nice easy way just to isolate your walls. And that brings me to our last drop-down list for today, which is our selections options. And this one is basically kind of a mass way to select things, as you can imagine. And maybe a bit faster than doing some of these options with Revit. So one of the first ones is to select non-framed walls. So if you do have any empty walls in the model, it does just that. It selects all of them in one go. And the nice thing with the selection option is that if you do have a template map set up, you can use Quick Create from that point, and it'll go ahead and auto frame all of those walls. Of course, if there isn't a template match found, if you've got foundation walls or something that isn't meant to be framed, it's fine. It'll just give you this pop-up saying that it couldn't find a template. So easy option, super useful when used with Quick Create. Besides that, if you're using model groups, you can select identical models or identical elements in that group. So you could also do that with Revit, of course, but an easy way just to be able to select those. But the main one I do want to talk about today is the selection set, since I think it is useful and not that commonly used. So the selection set is basically, again, a way to kind of mass select things, and it's set up a lot like Revit filters. So to give you an idea, we've already got sets for each different member types. So you can select your vertical studs in one go. If you want to see your headers, it'll be highlighted in the model. King studs. So we're just grabbing these members based on filters. And what is nice with the selection sets is that it's not just limited to the framing. You can set it up and create a new set for any category that you have in the project. So if I select my door type, maybe you've got a type mark associated to that door. So DR3. You can basically create a new set. I'm going to apply this to my doors. Let's say DR3. We'll call this selection set. And I can use the type mark parameter, and whenever that equals DR3, basically automatically selects them in the model. If I close out of here, they stay selected. So if you did want to go ahead and apply markers this way, en masse, you'll be able to. So it's a fairly easy setup. It's exactly like Revit filters in terms of workflow. And instead of just selecting all instances by the family type, if you had the same marker or same parameter applied to different door types, you'll be able to select those all in one go. So definitely a nice little feature. Again, just to be able to mass select some options in your project. Last few little options in this list for today. The next one after selection set is to select panel members. And this one is simple enough, but you can grab the wall, you can grab the label or one individual member. And it basically just highlights all of the members or any details that you have associated to this panel. So you can do it to a few different panels in one go. And I see two uses for this. It's an easy way to highlight and just see which members belong to which panels, especially for something that's a bit cluttered. And again, back to our positioning options. For member positioning, if you want to just do it on a few panels, if you want to just run the positioning on a few select panels, you do have to select all the members of that panel so it associates an ID. And that's where select panel members can come in handy as well. It highlights all the members in one go. And then if I did want to run positioning or get a count just on a few select panels, it'll run the positioning for just what I have selected. And last few options on this list, simple, but if ever you do want to hide your panels in the current view or a few select panels, then you've got these selection options. I can quickly just hide my panels. All it does is bring them into the red view. You can still click on the wall and access their properties. They're still live, they're just hidden. And then I could always bring those panels back. And the last two commands on this is just for selected panels. With the selection, what I do like is that if ever you do want to maybe just keep the label, but hide the members, again, maybe just for a layout, then it will at least let you keep those labels. Again, they're still active, but it'll just hide the steel for you temporarily. And then you could, of course, force them back and show the members. So that is going to be it for me today. As Tanya mentioned, if there's any questions, feel free to go ahead and ask them now.
Awesome. Thank you, Christina. As she mentioned, we have time to answer a few questions. If you'd like to pose a question live, please raise your hand now by clicking on the hand icon in the control panel. Just also please make sure that your audio is working correctly. While we wait for any questions to come through, I'd just like to remind everyone that a recording of the webinar will be sent through shortly after the session has ended. As always, please feel free to share this recording with any colleagues. And if you'd like to set up a one-on-one demo or have any questions after the session, we highly encourage you to reach out to our team. Contact details for our sales team and a support team will be provided with the recording. All right, I'm just going to give it a couple of seconds. All right, that seems like it's a wrap for today. Once again, I would just like to say thank you to Christina and thank you to everyone who registered for the webinar. All right, we'll now be ending the webinar. Have a great day.